Around this time last year, I made my own TANKHEAD conversion, along with a video on it, because I was inspired by Emerson Tung's TANKHEAD designs and the trailer for the narrative art book. Since then, the book's come out, I've read through it all, got caught up in the story of the world, marvelled at the many cool mechs, and wanted to do another build based on it. If you want to pick up the book yourself, the second print run should be on the Udon store soon. And there's also a few places to get it internationally too, so check the description for links to those. In case it's not obvious, I strongly recommend checking out the book. It's got amazing mech designs from Emerson Tung that constantly inspire me, as well as the interesting story of the World War inspired setting, told to the individual mech profiles written by Tim Popelia, which makes it a great read, tying individual stories of the mechs and their development into the ongoing Never War. My first kit bash was a bit of a test, practicing building something in that style. I'd say it went well, and now with a full encyclopedia of art and lore to go off of, I decided to make a full scale one, using a proper tank and a larger knight as the main kits. There's a lot of different tank heads and styles of them to use as inspiration. I chose to go with the Kaiserian faction, more specifically the Panzerkopf V Panther and others in that line, mostly because they have flatter armour than the other factions, which would be easier to make with plasticard. For the actual kits, a Questoris Knight was the obvious choice, and after looking at measurements, the Rogal Dorn tank seemed the one with a chassis size most similarly to the Questoris Knight's chest, and so I got to my first step of temporarily assembling some parts to check how they size up. It all fit together pretty well. The tank parts were a bit larger, which I took note of, but that was fine as I planned to extend and build out the knight parts in a few places to match. With the main kits confirmed, I started with the first step of a build like this, which is getting a frame or skeleton of the mech. Just a simple assembly of the parts to get a strong base that I can build on and fill out with detail later. And for a humanoid, it's a good idea to work from the ground up with the feet and legs, to get the balance of it sorted early, though it can result in locking in a neutral pose. Starting with the feet, I'm not a fan of the multi-directional toe pad type of design common to Warhammer mechs, so similar to my Armiger conversions, I removed all but one to leave at the back, and built a new front foot. I added some plasticard just for the base to build on, then reused some of the toes I cut off, and rearranged them along with some Doomcrawler weapon barrels to act as kind of pistons or supports. Then it was time to look at the legs. The tank parts would make the chest a bit bigger, so I wanted to extend the legs a little to match. And other knights, both Armigers and Chaos ones, have a 3-part leg, so I got some 3D printed leg extenders. But since the Questoris Knight legs come in one part, I had to cut up and reposition them a little to attach them properly. The legs being non-adjustable also got in the way of connecting them to the feet, as a lot of the ankle pistons wouldn't line up with the new positioning. But with some cutting, drilling and 2mm plastic rod, I made my own that I could adjust however I needed. Then it was time to connect the legs at the hips. Once again, I ran into problems with the limited ways the kit can normally be assembled, forcing the legs into a one in front, one behind, rigid kind of pose. I cut and sanded a lot of the normal connection points down to allow me to pose it more to my liking. It just needed a fair amount of plastic glue, and time to dry in an even position with support, so it would be sturdy enough to build more on later. Moving up, my first plan with the chest was to use the central part of the tank, mostly as is, and just fill in the sides with plasticard, like I did with my own TANKHEAD. But the whole tank body was too short and also too long at the back. So instead, I decided to cut up the tank parts, so I could armour them on top of the existing knight body. But there was still a lot of changes I needed to make to accommodate that. First up was widening the knight chest to match the tank parts, which I did by cutting open some connection points to glue the side chest panels more outwards. That also meant I'd need to fill out more of the back panel with extra plasticard too. Then I could start working on the main front tank armour I'd cut up. There were some adjustments to the knight's chest panels so it would all line up properly, which were a bit rough, but would mostly be covered by some plasticard sides for the tank armour. Taking a look at how the legs and chest were standing so far, I decided to also include another 3D printed extender piece, this time for the waist. The specific extender parts I got were STLs I found online and got a local 3D printing service to print for me, but I have found equivalent parts you can also just buy physically from Tarot Model Maker. Moving on to the arms, I used the shoulder, upper arm and elbow pieces from the Knight kit, but like many 40k designs, the fist is oversized and combined into the forearm, which really doesn't match the TANKHEAD art. Since I was just making the basic frame of the arms for now, I used the barrel of the larger Doomcrawler weapon as a forearm, and used some fists from Titanicus scale Reaver Titans, since they are smaller and match the TANKHEAD design better. All I did to change them was trim the top of them short and cut off some details on the back of the hand. The arms did sit a bit weird, but I wouldn't come back and change anything until later. For now, I moved on to the neck and head. The neck was an area I wanted to add a lot of mechanical details to, so I filled in the top of the chest with plasticard and sprue pieces, but a bit lower to leave room to build on later. I cut down a cylindrical piece from the back of one of the Knight's guns to use as a neck, and filled in the top side of it with plasticard, just with a magnet to connect to one I also put in the tank turret head, which was left pretty much as is. That was the basic frame done, so I could then move on to building it out, adding bits from other Warhammer kits to detail it, as well as armouring it with mostly plasticard. And again, I worked from the bottom up, starting with the extra ankle pistons from the Knight kit, with some being adjusted to fit like I did the others before. To armour the lower legs, I cut out pieces of plasticard to the right rough size for the area, and drew a grid on to help figure out the exact shape to make it. Once the individual panels are done, I glued them together at the edges, using plastic rod or sprue pieces on the inside for a more secure connection, and also to make sure it connects at the right angles. After sanding the outside edges smooth, I detailed the outsides of the plasticard armour using bits, 2mm metal wire bent into shape, and smaller and thinner plasticard cutting to more interesting shapes. I finished off the lower legs with a few more details around the ankles, using Cataphrone armour, some spare Titanicus parts I had, Doomcrawler foot supports to go under the armour, as well as finding some places to glue in magnets to make the armour detachable. For the upper legs, I added some cylindrical piston type pieces, taken from Doomcrawler weapons and foot supports, and I built out the front of the hips with an ammo box that normally goes on the side of one of the Knight's guns, with some armature and Titanicus pieces to cover the sides of that. I made some more plasticard armour for the thighs and crotch, using the same method as before, and also worked in some of the tank parts for the crotch piece. Then, to match the TANKHEAD art, I started working on some extra panels to go in front of the thighs. I wanted to use more parts of the tank's tread armour, so I figured out which parts would work the best, used armoured feet to connect them to the thigh armour, and added details to that to match it with the art and other armour I'd made. With the lower body armoured, I moved onto the torso. The front chest panel was mostly fine using the tank parts, but overall it was looking a little imbalanced, so I needed to make a back panel too. I tested out a few different shapes with plasticard, and also tried to work in some of the tank parts, both whole panels and other details cut out of parts I wouldn't be using. Like the other plasticard armour, I detailed the back panel, magnetised it, and started working on the neck area. This area I wanted to heavily detail, and give the impression of an extremely complex machine, with all sorts of exposed mechanical details peeking out between the armour. To do this, I used densely mechanical detail bits, mostly from the Cataphrone Battle Servitors kit. Starting with the big parts, then just fitting in smaller parts all around, until there was no plain plasticard left visible. Then, to finish the work in the chest section, I similarly detailed the sides of the chest, and filled in the abdomen section below the chest panel with some plasticard and sprue pieces. Moving on to detailing the arms, I needed to make the forearm section, using some plasticard for the bulk of it. Starting with a simple, mostly rectangular shape, then building out the elbow and cuff area with an extra layer of plasticard. But when testing shapes and sizes, I had trouble finding the right length to line up correctly with the rest of the model but also look proportional. After taking a step back to reevaluate, I found the source of the problem was actually with the shoulders. I had tried to make use of the chest and shoulder connection parts from the normal Knight kit, but they sat too low down for the way I built it. So I made a few alterations to the shoulder parts that allowed me to attach them further up. With that sorted, I went back to the forearms, which looked fine now with the plasticard armour and still using some Doomcrawler weapon barrel as a kind of inner bone. I wanted to leave some partially exposed mechanical details on the inner forearm, so I didn't add plasticard to that part, but instead added in some Dooncrawler foot supports to the weapon barrel to work as kind of piston grip muscles. I also added some Cataphront and Titanicus bits to detail around the wrists and elbows, as well as some thinner plasticard panels and 1mm squared plastic rod to detail the armour. Then, with a few more inner elbow piston details, made from leftover Dooncrawler foot support bits and plastic rod, I moved on to the shoulders. The TANKHEAD design I was mainly using for inspiration has some pretty distinct shoulder panels, which I wanted to match and also detail a lot, since the armour I made for my last TANKHEAD ended up being a bit too plain for my liking. I started by figuring out the right shape and size with plasticard, then used some 2mm square plastic rod to thicken the inside edges, and to add some detail on the outside, I cut some parts out of a thinner plasticard sheet of the same shape to glue on top. Then I made the handle parts out of more plasticard and plastic rod. To attach the panels to the shoulders, I used some plasticard to space it out correctly, then drill in some magnets. And as a final detail to the panels that wasn't necessary but a fun thing to practice, was some support or frame looking details using 1mm square plastic rod. Then, after a final bit of detailing under the arm connection and some bicep armour panels cut from Castellan robot legs, the work on the body was done, and that brought me to the titular TANKHEAD, which was mostly pretty simple as I could reuse the normal tank turret, but there were still a few changes I wanted to make. First, the armour directly behind the gun seemed a bit tall, so I cut it to match with the piece for the twin-barreled option part, and I also added a bar with some 2mm wire to match part of the TANKHEAD design. For the top details, I did drill into the hatch hinge parts, so I could glue in a paperclip wire that allowed the hatches to actually open and close, which I'd do more with later. I also drilled some holes at the front of the sides to glue in the smoke grenade launch parts that would normally sit on the tank's sponson guns. Then, I didn't like how tall some of the tank's top details were, so I only stuck with a shorter one, then used a double optic piece from a Scorpius disintegrator. Now, the way I'd built everything so far, the hatches, the magnetised armour, and mostly empty chest, allowed me to add an extra cool type of detail, that being an internal crew. Since I don't have a guard army, the main way I could use this model would be as a knight, probably allied with my AdMech army, so it makes sense to use Skitarii for the crew, and it helps that I have a lot of those parts to spare. I already even have some Skitarii made to come out of hatches from Dooncrawler and Scorpius kits, so I just use those, along with some helmets and weapons from other Skitarii kits, which, after some adjustments and magnetisation, could easily be added to the head. Then I started working on the chest internals, which would be a little more complicated. I started with cutting some plasticard to fit in as a floor panel, and Dooncrawler plasma weapon parts to fit in the back. I used plasma parts specifically because a development in the TANKHEAD setting means certain later TANKHEADs have Schwarzner reactors, an advanced energy power source, and plasma engines seemed an appropriate 40k equivalent. As for the chest crew, I wanted a driver in the front and another Skitarii in the back to act as an engineer and radio operator. For the driver, I had to do quite a bit of cutting and adjusting to make a seated Skitarii, with a chair made from various plastic materials, using steering levers made from taser goad weapons. And for the engineer, I used a Skitarii with a walkie-talkie arm and an arc pistol arm, cut up and adjusted to work as a kind of welding or inspection tool. Then, to go along with those, I made a few other internal details. There's a cut-down Armiger autocannon I lined up with the gun port on the front chest panel. There's various control panel pieces for both driver controls and wall details. There's a floor panel of double diamond pattern plasticard, and an automatic ammo loader made from a Cataphront arm holding a shell part and a servo skull that I glued into the wall. This was all magnetised, mostly so it would be easier to paint individually later, and all that left me with a mostly complete TANKHEAD and Skitarii to crew it. Then it was time to make the base. I could have made a base to match with the rest of my AdMech or my Onager TANKHEAD, but the TANKHEAD book, along with numerous mechs and history of the setting, also includes some landscape shots of certain important areas in the world, which I wanted to reference as well. I won't show the whole picture, but I chose a page of a Khazarian landscape, where the main tank head I was looking at for inspiration came from, and I mostly looked at the floor details, which were a panelled floor with bridge supports and some gears, wires or pipes on the outside of it. I made the bridge supports using some square plastic rod, and for the gears I got some resin parts from Zinj Industries, which is where I also got the tank ammo parts I used for the loader arm earlier. The floor panelling has an unusual kind of random pattern of horizontal and vertical lines. To recreate something like that myself, I drew some regular rectangular panels on plasticard, and on top of that, I traced the edges of the plasticard sheets I cut from. I then cut along those lines, sanded the edges down a little, and glued the panels down. And that completed the base, aside from one element that would come from the last step of building. But just quickly before that, I added a few minor details to areas that were too plain or needed covering up, just using Doomcrawler foot support pistons and cat front armour panels. Now the last steps of my building are detail passes that make sense to do all at the same time once everything else is in place, and for this model they are adding green stuff wires and rivets. Riveting is to replicate actual rivets used on tanks which hold the armour in place, along the edges of panels, which works well as it's a way to detail the very plain plasticard parts, especially as these details already exist on the parts I used from the Warhammer kits. But I use 1mm ball bearings, which I glue into shallow holes of the same size that I drill in. Then the other detail is green stuff wires, where green stuff is rolled into wires of a few different patterns, using a wire roller that I got from Green Stuff World. I use these to go between mechanical components and to add to plain areas, to make parts feel a bit more connected and coherent, not just randomly glued on bits. I always tend to make a few more wires than necessary, because leftovers also make for a quick and easy basing detail, which I needed in particular for this unit's base, like I mentioned earlier. But that finally completed all the building, so I disassembled it all to get it painted. The dark metals and the slightly bluish grey of the art mostly matches my existing AdMech colour scheme, so it kept that choice simple and something I already knew how to do. The first step was to get a consistent black base over everything using a black primer. Then I could dry brush the main colours. I'm more of a builder than a painter, so I really like the quick coverage dry brushing achieves, while still leaving some simple shading by not painting the dark recesses. For the frame, I heavily dry brushed it with the dark silver paint Iron Warriors, and followed up with a lighter dry brush with 2 thin coats' Surcoat Silver to highlight. For the armour panels, I started with a heavy dry brush of Mechanicus Standard Grey. This one needed 2 passes of that paint for even coverage. Then afterwards I followed up with a light dry brush of Dawnstone, and then an even lighter dry brush of Administratum Grey, specifically focusing on the edges and the upper parts of the model. Then I just regularly painted the metal parts on the grey areas, and vice versa, and the biggest parts of the model were painted to a decent standard pretty quickly. The next biggest parts of the paint scheme were brighter silver parts, copper details and red wires on the frame, and the white stripes on the arm. I used Corn Red for the wires, 2 thin coats' plate armour for the brighter silver of the inner pistons, and Balthazar Gold for the copper, just picking out any details on the frame I like the look of or that match the corresponding copper parts of the art. My freehanding isn't good enough to paint the white lines by hand, so I masked off the areas with Tamiya masking tape and stippled on the light grey paint, Grey Seer, with my dry brush. And while I had the Grey Seer out, I also painted any lights, optics and camera lenses with it to prepare it for the next step of contrasts. For a quick and simple blue glow, I like to use Athematic Blue over the camera and optic areas I previously painted white. And I also use the contrast paint Black Templars over some other wires to add a darker colour and a duller finish, just to add more variety to the frame parts. That was all the colours on the model, so I started applying decal, using a sheet of AdMech transfers as they work great for mechs, with unit markings, faction logos, warning symbols and maker's marks. I applied the decals normally with water, then went over them with decal softener just to make sure they sit properly. Then to blend them in, I paint over the edges of them with the base armour colour Mechanicus Standard Grey, and shade them along with the rest of the armour. The shading wasn't strictly necessary, as the armour already had some basic shading from the dry brushing, but it helps integrate the decals, darkens the armour colour, which was a bit too bright for my liking, and the extra depth it brings to the model is always nice. For the actual shade, I used a mix of Army Painter's strong tone and dark tone washes, which I just applied to the non-silver details I painted on the frame as well as all of the armour parts. With that done, I moved on to painting the base, trying to roughly match the colours of the landscape art. For the kind of rusty bronzy colour of the side parts, I started with a heavy dry brush of the dark brown dryad bark on the sides. I followed that up with a dry brush of Warplock bronze, and then a light dry brush of Iron Warriors to highlight. I dry brushed the supports with Corn red, and for the floor panels in the middle, I dry brushed on a few coats of Storm Vermin fur, and regularly painted the narrow panels on the outside with Administratum grey. And to wrap up the base, I shaded it with the same black-brown wash mix I used for the tank head itself. For the very final touches of the tank head, I fixed any mistakes I noticed using the original colours, painted over all the rivets with Iron Warriors, and got to highlight it. I kept this part simple and just went over the upper facing areas and edges with brighter shades of the original colours. I used Evil Sun Scarlet for the red wires, Ashut Copper for the copper, Plate Armour for the silver, and Dawnstone for the armour, followed up with Administratum Grey for just the very highest edges and corners of it. And that's how I made my Dorn tank head. More than 4 months of work went into this, my longest and biggest build to date, and probably my most complex too. So there might have been a few specifics I didn't properly cover to stop this video being too long, so if you have any questions I'd be happy to answer them in the comments. This build also lines up around the year anniversary of my previous tank head, and my first build breakdown I uploaded to YouTube. So thank you to all 11,000 of you who've subscribed in this first year. I'm surprised but glad so many people think the stuff I make is cool enough to stick around to see. Once again, definitely consider picking up the TANKHEAD Mechanical Encyclopedia book. If you like the kind of stuff I make, you'll like the book, as I frequently take heavy inspiration from Tung's designs. Not just the full conversions, but even concepts and how to add small details to other builds too. If you want to keep up with what I'm building between videos, you can find me on other sites like Twitter and Instagram, linked in the description. And if you want to support me more directly, I have a Patreon, where I also occasionally post behind the scenes stuff, building tips, and talk about future model and video plans. And speaking of that, I'd like to give big thanks to those currently supporting me on Patreon. The Lich's Laboratory, Tucker Hill, Philip Mitchell, Kyra, Talleyrun, and Sterling.